Our story takes place in New Orleans, the most European of American cities, where our artistic hero named John Kennedy Toole was born. He lived in this city most of his life, breathing in his unique hometown's flavor from its food and music to its colorful characters. He grew up in these neighborhoods, attended schools, and then went on his travels that took him from New York to Lafayette, back to New York, then Puerto Rico, only to return to his roots in New Orleans to complete his literary masterpiece, A Confederacy of Dunces, the book that would be his life's triumph. But Ken Toole was more than just a writer. He was also a loving only child, devoted to his parents, admired and respected by his friends and colleagues, a teacher who taught many students his own love of the written word. It's impossible to converse with the man now, but we have memories of him. Thanks to those who have documented his life and those fortunate few still around who knew him well.
Hi, I'm Marty Luke, and 50 years ago, I walked onto this campus as a brand new freshman at St. Mary's Dominican College. And I'm delighted to say that one teacher that stands out among them was John Kennedy Toole, the author of Confederacy of Dunces. He came here as a brand new teacher, the same time I came as a brand new college student. And I graduated in the spring of 1969, but by then, John Kennedy Toole had taken his own life. And it took years for any of us who loved him, and we did love him, to understand, at least somewhat, what had happened in his short, turbulent life that had brought him to that fateful decision in March on the Gulf Coast. This building was really the heart of Dominican College when I was attending here. We had classrooms on the second floor. We gathered here, particularly in this beautiful front yard, for a number of activities. The gazebo, the stone gazebo, is really iconic, and the minute I saw it, I was just brought back to that time. You know, I'm really curious to find out if any of the nuns who taught me and therefore would have known John Kennedy Toole also are still here, because there is a spot in this building that is reserved for the Dominican nuns. So I'm gonna go see if we can find somebody. Well, Sister Eugene, could you tell us what you remember about Mr. Toole?
I was the treasurer at the time, and so I didn't have that much to do with him, but the girls loved him. He was always very well dressed and very, dressed to the nines, I guess you would call it. And they really loved his class. And but he was different. He was very quiet around, and then it sounded like the class was much more active than his coordination. He was very good friends with Sister May Beatrice, and she was head of the English department. So they had a very good relationship. So I know she was devastated when we finally got the news about John.
What was he like as a child?
Well, I think the main thing was he was a very smart child. He was also kind of reserved and quiet. And a lot of that probably was because his mother was such a dominant sort of personality that it was easy for him to sort of recede into the background until she forced him into the limelight to perform or speak. But I do remember walking to school right from this street, Coliseum Street, to McDonough 14 for kindergarten. And Kenny told me one day as we were walking that after the war, after World War II, we were going to have television. And I asked him what was television. And he started to explain it was like having a radio with a little movie attached to it. And I thought he was crazy, so I looked at his mother, and she assured me that Kenny knew exactly what he was talking about, that after the war we would have television. Truthfully, his mother always was the whole show whenever she was around. So my earliest recollections of him are somebody who was really very, very smart, but in a way somebody that you really needed to kind of protect and look out for. He was very, very quiet.
Was he a happy child in your memory?
I think he was. He wasn't, I don't think he was as happy as the other children were, because his mother was certainly much stricter. He had to spend a lot of time with his studies and learning stuff. In February 1943, we started the first part of kindergarten, and that's when we went to McDonough 14 on Jefferson Avenue. At the end of June, when we were out of kindergarten, parents knew that if we took a test at the school board and passed the test, we could skip the second half of kindergarten in September. So we did take that test, and my parents had told me that if I did well on that test, I could have anything I wanted. And anything I wanted was a leather jacket. And so I got my leather jacket. I wore that leather jacket until it fell apart. But poor Kenny's reward for passing the test was he got a set of the first grade textbooks so that he could spend the summer studying and not be left behind by these older students that we were going to be classmates with in first grade. His mother was always so intent on being very serious about his studies and
buying him books instead of a leather jacket.
Yeah. His father was an automobile salesman, and Kenny was just a fanatic for automobiles. And he could spot, I mean, even when he was a little kid, 5 and 6 years old, he could tell you the make and model of every car that went down the street.
Wow.
And years later, people in the neighborhood, older people, said that they were just amazed at this little kid that knew so much about cars.
Wonderful.
Well, this was the apartment that Mr. and Ms. Toole moved to in 1937, shortly before Kenny was born, at Toole Hospital. You know, uptown was sort of the place to grow up, and the schools were good uptown. So I think that's a lot of Mrs. Toole's motivation in moving up here, so that Kenny would really grow up to be an uptown baby, be an uptown person rather than a downtown person. The little stairway there on the side of the house was the entrance to the living room, and part of the house where the Tooles lived in was their living room. And in that living room was the first baby grand piano that I ever saw. Mrs. Toole got that piano when they were first married, and she just loved to play the piano. And she continued to play the piano until she died. There is a wonderful photograph of Kenny as a little boy sitting on those steps that Corey McLaughlin featured in his book, Butterfly and the Typewriter. This is where she was living when Confederacy of Dunces was finally published by LSU Press. This is where she was sitting in the living room right here when she received the news that the book had won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1980. Mrs. Toole grew up next door in the Duquin family house, which was on this site right to my left. And along about 1960, her brother built this new house and moved into it, and then the old house was torn down. Ms. Toole's brother, Arthur Duquin, lived in this house until she had fallen after Mr. Toole died, and she ended up in the hospital, and then her brother Arthur insisted that she come and move into this house with him. And this is where she was living when she died. Actually, she died in St. Charles General Hospital, but this was her residence at the time that she died. She kind of, even though Arthur owned the house, she kind of pushed that aside, kind of took over the house, and in fact, in her will, she decreed that this house would be turned into a museum. And she designated Joel Fletcher and me to be the curators of this museum. Of course, she didn't own the house, so this just couldn't happen. But her brother, who did own the house, eventually willed the house to Tulane, and I think they've sold it, and the proceeds from that went into the John Kennedy Toole Scholarship Fund at Tulane, which now is worth close to $2 million.
In 1969, John Kennedy Toole was laid to rest, never to have seen his book come to life. But life, like art, has a funny way of revealing itself. In the end, John Kennedy Toole's life, while short, was also a reason to celebrate. His mortal life may have ended, but his immortal book and its memorable characters will live on.
Welcome to New Orleans!